I never thought I'd escape, not from him, not from the fear that lived in my bones, in the silence that stretched between every breath. My father's presence was like the air in that house, heavy, suffocating, inescapable. Some people say fear sharpens your senses, makes you more aware, but when you live in it long enough, it dulls everything. It turns you into a shadow of yourself, waiting for the next blow, the next cruel word, the next night that might never end. But death changed everything, and not just once, 3 times. The first time, I saw something that no one had ever told me existed. A light that was more than light, a presence that knew me in ways I didn't even know myself. The second time, I understood things no human mind should be able to comprehend. Numbers, patterns, the very fabric of existence. And the third time, that was when I finally understood why I was still here. This isn't just a story about pain, it's about what lies beyond it. It's about what I learned when I left my body, when I crossed into a place beyond time, beyond suffering, beyond human understanding. It's about the moment I realized that even in my darkest hours, I was never truly alone. If you've ever wondered what happens after death, if you've ever felt lost, broken, or like the universe had forgotten you, then stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you might change the way you see everything. When people talk about childhood, they often paint it in colors of innocence, laughter, and warm summer days. But my childhood was painted in bruises, in whispers of dread, in the cold silence of a house where love never settled. My father was not just a man, he was a storm, unpredictable and relentless. Some days he was distant, as if I didn't exist. Other days his anger filled every corner of the house, crashing down on me like waves against fragile stone. Fear was my first language. I learned to read the shift in his posture, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands curled into fists, long before he ever struck. The fear taught me survival. Walk lightly. Speak only when necessary. Disappear when you can. But no matter how invisible I tried to be, the rage always found me. I remember the nights most vividly, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting, listening for his footsteps. Would they pass by my door, or would they stop? And if they stopped, what then? The weight of uncertainty pressed against my chest like a hand I couldn't push away. School should have been an escape, but even there the fear followed. I couldn't speak like other kids, not because I didn't know how, but because I was afraid of what might happen if I said the wrong thing. Friendships were dangerous. What if someone found out? What if they asked about the bruises? What if they made me believe, even for a second, that life could be different? Hope was more painful than fear, because hope meant disappointment. And my mother, she was there, but in many ways she wasn't. She existed in the same prison, only she had long since stopped trying to escape. Maybe she thought surrendering to the pain made it easier. Maybe she believed there was no way out. But I wasn't ready to accept that, not yet. Somewhere deep inside, beneath all the terror and the silence, there was a voice whispering, "This isn't how your story ends." But I didn't know if that voice belonged to me or something greater. At the age of 9, I learned what it truly meant to be free, though it wasn't in the way I expected. The day I died for the first time is etched into my memory as clearly as any scar, though the pain of that moment has long since faded. It wasn't a dramatic, loud thing. There was no bright light at first, no flash of angelic music, just a sudden, quiet release. The kind that comes when your body gives out and your soul knows it's been set free. One moment I was lying in bed, the familiar ache of fear and exhaustion curling around my body like a vice, and the next I was weightless. The pain, the suffocating grip of fear, the bruises I had spent years hiding, gone, all of it. In their place was an overwhelming sense of lightness, of freedom, as if I were no longer tethered to the earth. I was floating above the ground, suspended in an empty space where there was no weight, no worry, no ache. Below me was our backyard, once a place of dread, where I could never escape the clutches of my father's rage. But in that moment, I didn't see the broken fence, the overgrown weeds, or the dark shadows that haunted the corners of our yard. I didn't see the prison that had been my home. All I saw was the purest, most comforting light I could ever imagine. Bright but soft, so gentle, as if it were made just for me. It didn't burn or hurt. It didn't force itself on me. It welcomed me, and for the first time in my life, I felt seen. This wasn't the sun or the gleaming halo I'd read about in church. No, this was something else entirely, a presence, a feeling that wrapped around me like the most comforting hug. The kind of hug that tells you you are not alone, you are loved, completely without question. The light pulsed softly, and I knew instinctively this was God. Not a man with a beard on a throne, but something far beyond human comprehension, something eternal. It wasn't a voice I heard, not in the way we speak. It was something deeper, something that resonated in every part of me, like a vibration in my very soul. "You are here because you have something to do," it said. The words didn't come from outside of me, but from within, like a thought, but not my thought. The message was clear. I had a purpose. Me, the girl who had never known love, never felt worthy of anything beyond pain, was told that I had a reason to exist. And then came the question, "Do you wish to continue?" The words, though gentle, carried an enormous weight. I didn't need to ask what it meant. I understood immediately. It was the question that would decide whether I stayed in the light or went back to the darkness that had been my life up until then. The darkness that was my father's rage, my mother's absence, my own brokenness. Without a second thought, I answered yes. I didn't understand why. I didn't care. All I knew was that I wanted to serve, to be a part of whatever this was, to bathe in this love that was so pure, so overwhelming, that it made everything else, my pain, my fear, my past, seem so small in comparison. The light swirled around me, and I felt as if I were part of something much larger than myself. I didn't belong in my body anymore. I belonged here, in the embrace of something far beyond human understanding. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light began to fade, like the last echoes of a dream slipping away in the morning. It wasn't a painful return, but it was a jarring one. My body, once light and free, felt heavy again. The warmth of the light was gone. I was back in my skin, back in my world, and though the light had vanished, the memory of it remained like a soft whisper, a promise that something better existed beyond the suffering I had known. And I wasn't alone. Not anymore. The love from that moment stayed with me, even though the world around me didn't change. It was like a spark in the dark, small, almost insignificant, but it burned, and I carried it with me, clinging to it like a lifeline, because I now knew, deep within, that there was something greater out there, something that cared. It was a truth I couldn't deny, no matter how much the pain of my life tried to convince me otherwise. But the light faded, and I fell back into the cold reality of my world, into the house where my father still raged and my mother still watched, as if nothing had changed. But something inside of me had, something deep and unshakable. It was the first whisper of my transformation, a transformation that had started with the light and would one day, in ways I couldn't yet understand, break the cage built from my pain. When I came back to the world, it was like a slap in the face, a cold, brutal reminder that I was still here. My body felt alien, like a heavy, unwelcome shell that had somehow trapped me once again. The warmth of the light, the peace, the freedom, was gone, and I was plunged back into the suffocating weight of reality. But something inside me had shifted, something deep and unbreakable. I had glimpsed a truth, greater than anything my father's fists or my mother's silence could shatter. I wasn't the same person I had been before, and though the outside world hadn't changed, the same shadows clung to the corners of our house, the same thick silence hung in the air. I was different. I could feel it in the way I moved, in the way I looked at things, the heaviness of fear, of helplessness, that had clung to me for so long. It wasn't gone entirely, but it had lessened, like a weight lifted off my chest. The scars my father had left on me were still there, but I felt like I had more than just the will to survive them now. I had purpose. I wasn't afraid anymore, not in the way I had been, not of my father's anger, not of the loneliness that always followed him, and certainly not of the hollow void that had once seemed so consuming. For the first time, I saw the world through a lens that was shaped by love, Love I had felt from the light, from the presence I had encountered. A love that was bigger than any hurt I had ever known. It was a love that whispered to me, "You are more than your pain. You are not the sum of your suffering." And when I walked back into that house, there was a shift, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. It wasn't that my father's rage disappeared, far from it, but something had changed in me, and it didn't take long for him to notice. I had learned something in that light, a truth about power, about control, about forgiveness that had been hidden from me my entire life. I had always seen my father as this towering, uncontrollable force. His anger, his violence had always felt like something bigger than me, something that I couldn't fight against. But now, when I looked at him, I saw something different, a man filled with his own pain, his own fear, his own brokenness. He wasn't invincible, he wasn't all-powerful. He was just another human being. And in that realization, I found power. Not the kind of power that comes from fear, violence, or dominance, but the kind of power that comes from understanding, from seeing the person behind the anger, the pain behind the cruelty. I began to understand deeply and painfully that hurt people hurt people. My father had been a victim of his own demons, his own fears. And though that didn't excuse what he had done to me, it gave me a perspective I had never had before. He wasn't just the monster who had broken me. He was a man who had been broken himself. The next time he raised his voice, I didn't flinch. When he slammed a fist into the wall, I didn't cower. My heart pounded, yes, but it wasn't out of fear, it was because I had changed. And I couldn't go back to that frightened girl who had hidden in corners and hoped the violence would stop. I knew in that moment that I wasn't powerless anymore. I didn't know what to do with that newfound strength at first. I couldn't change my father overnight. I couldn't make him see the world through my eyes or undo the years of hurt he had caused, but I could change myself, and that was the most powerful thing I could do. So I began to take back my power in the smallest ways, ways that only I would understand. When he yelled, I wouldn't flinch. I wouldn't shrink. I would hold my ground, even if only in my mind. When he tried to intimidate me, I would mentally say, "You don't control me anymore." And then came the night when everything changed. He had just finished one of his rages, slamming doors and throwing things around. I could hear the familiar thud of his boots stomping around the house, his words laced with venom, his anger spewing out in every direction. But instead of retreating to my room, instead of hiding away like I used to, I stayed. I went outside, into the yard where he often stood when he was about to lash out, the place where I had always felt trapped, as though the world itself had locked me in. But not anymore. The yard no longer felt like a prison. It was just dirt and grass and the faded remnants of my father's control. I stood in front of him, my voice calm but firm. "I need to talk to you," I said. He stopped, his hand hovering mid-air, as if the words I'd spoken had caught him off guard. He didn't immediately tell me to go away, didn't bark some command at me. He just stared at me for a long moment. His expression shifted, and in the darkness of that night, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred, it was confusion, maybe even fear. And in that moment, I knew that I had power, not the kind of power that comes from fear or submission, but the kind that comes from facing a person not as an enemy, but as a fellow soul. A soul, perhaps, who was also looking for something to hold on to, something to believe in. "I want to be baptized," I said simply. His eyes flickered, his lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't shout, didn't insult me. He just nodded slowly, a faint tremor in his hands. "Okay," he said, almost whispering. "I'll talk to the preacher." The very man who had spent years controlling me, filling my life with terror, was now at a loss for words, and in that silence I realized something profound. The power I had gained wasn't just for me, it was for him too. It was for both of us. My decision to reclaim my power, to stand in front of him without fear, had shaken him. It had planted a seed. That was the turning point, the moment the power dynamic in our house shifted. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of something new, a shift in perception, a shift in how we saw each other. And it all started with one simple decision: to stop being afraid, to stop letting the darkness control me, and instead to stand in the light, no matter how faint. Because that's what real power is, isn't it? It's not about dominating others. It's about finding the courage to stand firm in who you are, even in the face of everything that tries to break you. And when you do that, everything else shifts. Even the hardest hearts begin to crack. It was a few years after the baptism. Things were better, different, at least, but still the scars remained. I had learned to see my father as someone who was hurting, and while that had shifted the dynamic between us, the healing was still a slow process. The emotional bruises didn't fade overnight. But in the quiet moments when I was alone, I would find myself asking questions that had always haunted me since my first near-death experience. What had happened when I crossed over to that realm? What was the point of it all? I wasn't the same person I had been, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to learn. And then, one night, it happened again. I had been sick, nothing out of the ordinary, just the kind of fever that comes with the changing of seasons. But as the night grew darker, the fever got worse. I remember lying on the couch, my body burning with heat, my mind muddled, and my head aching. I could barely hold my eyes open. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in my body. I wasn't in my house either. I was somewhere else. A vast, empty expanse stretched out before me like an endless canvas. No stars, no sky, just blackness as far as I could see. But in the silence of that space, I felt something, a presence, a force. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a figure, but it was something far greater than me, something that felt like the very fabric of existence itself. And then, like a wave crashing over me, everything became clear. I was not alone. It wasn't terrifying, not in the way I expected. No fear, no panic, just an overwhelming sense of peace and understanding. I wasn't sure if I was dead or alive, or if there was even a difference anymore. Time didn't seem to exist in this place. But I felt an immense connection, as if I was one with everything, one with the universe. And then the knowledge came. I didn't hear it, not like a conversation, it wasn't words, but it was knowing. This wasn't just a dream, this wasn't just my mind unraveling, this was something real, something beyond the confines of the physical world. And then I saw it, a figure. She was like no one I had ever seen before. She was tall, her skin glowing like the northern lights, her eyes black, vast, almost as if they held the secrets of the universe, locked with mine. And without a single word spoken, I knew she wasn't here to hurt me. She was here to show me something. Her presence wasn't cold as I had expected. It was warm, almost comforting. She exuded a calm, a quiet wisdom, like she had seen and understood the very fabric of time itself. And in that moment, I knew that whatever was happening to me, whatever I was experiencing, was part of something much, much bigger. The strange thing was, I wasn't afraid. The alien, yes, that's what she was. She wasn't threatening, she wasn't a monster, she was just different. And as I stood there, unsure of what to do or say, she did something I didn't expect. She spoke to me, not with words, but with a knowing. It was like her thoughts reached out to me, not in a way that could be described by language, but in a way that felt like communication. Are you going to stop hiding? I blinked, startled. It wasn't just the question that shocked me, it was the implication. She knew. She knew everything. And suddenly, all the walls I had built up in my mind, all the defenses I had thrown around my soul crumbled. I stepped forward, slowly, unsure of what was happening, but no longer fearful. I wasn't just floating in a void, I wasn't alone. And then the screen appeared. It was like a giant glowing film, suspended in the space around us. Images of my life, moments I had long forgotten, flashed before me. I was stunned, watching them as if they were someone else's memories. But what struck me most was the realization that none of it mattered the way I had thought it did. What mattered was the present. What mattered was how I chose to live in the now, how I chose to love, to heal, to forgive. The alien figure didn't explain it to me. She didn't have to. The knowledge wasn't something that needed to be spoken. It was something that I felt in my bones. And in the next instant, the scene was gone, and I was pulled back to the world of flesh and bone. But I wasn't the same. I was changed. The third and final time I came close to death, it wasn't as peaceful as before. It was the night I had given up, the night I thought I couldn't take any more. The bruises were still there, the pain from my father's cruelty still raw, but it was the words he spoke that night that broke me. "I hate you," he said, his voice calm, almost detached. "I've thought about killing you before, but I don't want to get caught." It wasn't just the physical pain anymore, it was the emotional devastation. I had always known he hated me, but to hear him say it in such a cold, casual way, it shattered something inside me. I felt like I wasn't even worth the effort of pretending he cared. I didn't know how to go on. I didn't know how to survive it. So I made a prayer, not a desperate cry for help, but a final wish. "God, please let me die." And then the pain came, a sudden, violent surge that exploded in my head, unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt like my brain was splitting open, every nerve searing with agony. I gasped for air, my body racked with pain. But then it stopped. Just like that, everything went silent. I wasn't in my body anymore. I wasn't in my house. I wasn't even in this world anymore. I was floating in a vast, infinite darkness with no sound, no light, no time, nothing. And for a moment, I wasn't scared. It was calm, it was still. And then I understood. I was still here. Even in the dark, even in the empty void, I was still aware. I hadn't disappeared. I hadn't died. I was floating in a place where time didn't matter, and in that space, I knew that I wasn't truly alone. I was loved, even if I didn't fully understand how. Suddenly, a presence surrounded me, warm and expansive, and in that instant, everything shifted. I was shown, not told, the truth of existence, the truth of love. And I realized then that everything, all the pain, all the suffering, had been a part of something I couldn't yet fully comprehend. But I knew one thing for certain. I was more than my pain. I was more than the years of abuse. And in that moment, I chose to return. I chose to live. When I woke up, it wasn't like waking from a dream. It wasn't the same as coming back from a sleep. It was as if I had been thrown back into my body with a force so powerful that I couldn't help but gasp, my chest heaving with the suddenness of it. But this time, I was different. The girl who had curled up in fear, the one who had been powerless against the anger of her father, was gone. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living. I had been shown a truth, a love so immense that I couldn't deny it. I wasn't alone, and neither was anyone else. And so I began to act on what I had learned. I began to forgive, not because I had to, but because I understood. I understood that my father wasn't a monster. He wasn't just a villain in my story. He was a broken man. A man who had hurt others because he had never known how to heal. And so I chose love, even when it was hard, even when he didn't deserve it. I chose to see him not as my abuser, but as a man who had his own wounds. That wasn't easy, it wasn't perfect. But with each act of forgiveness, with each choice to love instead of hate, the darkness around us began to fade. Slowly we both healed, and for the first time in my life, I saw a future where love, not fear, ruled the day. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the past would haunt me, when the memories of the pain would rise up like ghosts. But each time I would return to that truth. Love is the force that heals. Even in the darkest moments, we are never truly alone. And I carried that truth with me, for I knew it was more real than anything the world had ever tried to teach me. As time passed, the changes in me became undeniable. I wasn't just walking a new path for myself anymore. I realized I was walking it for others too. There was something deeply cathartic about sharing my story, about shedding light on the experiences I had buried for so long. The more I opened up to people, family, friends, even strangers, the more I saw how many of us were hiding our pain, carrying burdens that no one else could see. We were all walking around with these invisible scars, pretending they weren't there, as though being strong meant never showing vulnerability. But through my story, I began to see a pattern. The more I shared my truth, the more others felt empowered to share theirs. And in that exchange, something magical happened. We weren't just telling stories, we were healing each other. The act of sharing became a way of breaking down the walls that had been built around our hearts. It was in those moments of raw honesty, of revealing our darkest fears, that we found the strength to rise above them. And it wasn't just the sharing that made a difference. It was the understanding that followed, the empathy, the recognition that we weren't alone, that there were others out there who had lived through similar struggles, who knew what it felt like to break and still rise again. In many ways, I owe my healing not just to the experiences I had, but to the connections I made after. The people who reached out, who listened, who shared their own stories. Their words and support were like medicine to my soul, allowing me to keep going even on the days when the weight of the past threatened to pull me back down. And through this process, I began to realize something powerful. Healing isn't just a solo journey. We heal best when we heal together. When we share our pain, our victories, and our wounds with each other, we create a web of strength that can catch us when we fall. Healing wasn't something that happened overnight, nor was it a one-time fix. It wasn't a destination, it was a process, a journey that stretched into every part of my life. As I began to rebuild my life, I realized that the old ways of living no longer served me. I could no longer just go through the motions. I had to be intentional. I had to actively create a life that aligned with who I had become, someone who valued love, peace, and healing above all else. This shift didn't happen without resistance. The world and my past didn't just let go of me easily. There were moments of doubt, times when I questioned whether I was strong enough to keep moving forward. But with every choice I made to step into my truth, whether it was forgiving, loving, or setting boundaries, I began to build a foundation that felt solid beneath me. At first, it was small changes, choosing to spend time with people who uplifted me, not those who drained me, taking care of my body, honoring it as a temple, not as something to punish. And slowly, the shift started to take hold in every aspect of my life. I started to pay more attention to what I was feeding my mind, the kind of content I was consuming, the conversations I engaged in. I filled my space with things that nourished me, whether that was music, books, or people who inspired me to grow. I set clear boundaries with my father, no longer allowing his toxic energy to dictate the terms of our relationship. And in all of this, I realized something profound. Healing isn't just about undoing the damage. It's about actively creating a life that is designed for peace, love, and growth. It's about rewriting the script of your existence, one conscious choice at a time. Through all of the hardships I've been through, one thing has remained crystal clear. The pain of my past wasn't something I could erase, but it didn't have to define me either. Instead, I chose to use it. I chose to transform that pain into a source of power. I took everything I had endured, the loneliness, the abuse, the fear, and used it as a springboard to create something that could make a difference in the world. I became passionate about sharing my story, not just for the sake of getting it out there, but because I knew that it could help others. There's a kind of strength that comes from looking at your darkest moments and realizing that they don't have to break you. In fact, they can be the very thing that propels you forward into your greatest work. I found my voice by confronting the silence of my past. I found my purpose by daring to speak about the things that no one wanted to talk about. And as I began to help others, I saw how deeply they resonated with what I was sharing. I realized that the very things I had tried to hide, my fears, my failures, my vulnerabilities, were the things that made me relatable. They were the things that allowed me to connect with people in a way that felt real. I became determined to help others who had been through similar experiences, to show them that they too could turn their pain into purpose. I started coaching, sharing my journey publicly, and working with groups who needed guidance in healing their own wounds. It was the most fulfilling work I had ever done. In helping others, I found the ultimate redemption. Looking back, I can now see that everything, the suffering, the silence, the trauma, was leading me to this moment. Each step, no matter how painful, was bringing me closer to the realization that I am whole, even in my brokenness. I am worthy of love, even when I don't have it all together. I am allowed to be imperfect and still valuable. One of the hardest lessons I've had to learn is that healing is not linear. It's messy. It's complicated. There will be moments when you take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But that's okay. What matters is that you keep moving. What matters is that you embrace the beauty in the imperfections, in the messiness of life. Because it's in those moments that we truly discover who we are. The truth is, I'll never be done healing. There will always be layers to peel back, wounds to tend to, and lessons to learn. But the difference now is that I'm not afraid of it anymore. I no longer view healing as a destination, but as an ongoing journey. A journey that I get to walk with intention, with purpose, and with love. In the end, it's the imperfections that make us human, and it's in embracing those imperfections that we find our true strength. To anyone listening, anyone reading this, I want you to know that you are not alone. Whatever you're facing, whether it's the weight of your past, the loneliness of your present, or the fear of your future, know that there is always a way out. There is always light beyond the darkness, even if you can't see it right now. You have the power to transform your pain into purpose, to use your struggles as the very fuel that propels you toward the life you were always meant to lead. The journey is hard, but it's worth it, and I'm living proof that even in your darkest moments, you can rise again. Take 1 step at a time and keep going. Embrace your imperfections and never, ever give up on your healing. You're a warrior. You've got this.